everyone. Thanks for coming out and your participation today. Thank you to the whole team, Lee Math, everyone here at Yale for having me back again. It's a great honor and a privilege to be here. I've had the good fortune of being here before, working with your dining services, and Ron DeSantis, your executive chef here, and Rafi. Ron was actually my boss when I was teaching at the Culinary Institute of America. I was a chef for many years before dropping into a different career path, and which is one that sort of taken its own evolutionary path, and I'm thrilled with what I'm doing. I've had wonderful fortune of being an explorer with the National Geographic Society, and that has been such an eye-opening experience and just a dream job. And every time that I think about what I do, and I feel a little bit like I'm the cool kid, David Duboulet has to step on stage and prove to me that he is in fact the homecoming king of the halls of National Geographic. Your work is so amazing, and it's such an honor and a privilege to be affiliated and associated with such great work that's really helped to create such a visual, as you say, understanding, but also an emotional understanding of our world. And so congratulations to this whole seminar and the panelists today for all the work that you're doing on the same front. When I was growing up, my parents took two things very, very seriously. The first was reading, and the second one was food. I was born and raised in a neighborhood in Mount Pleasant, D.C. It was a highly ethnic neighborhood, and ethnicities from all over the world, from El Salvador to Guatemala, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Korea. I mean, it really was a Noah's Ark of people. And my parents took advantage of that. They were both very intrepid cooks and adventurous at that. And I remember from a very early age, going into these little corner bodegas that serviced each of these cultures and, provided for their ingredient needs here. And I can still remember to this day what an Eritrean spice aisle smells like, and that heady, sensual aroma almost just arresting you in your thought process because it is so intense. From the pupusas, from El Salvadorian cuisine, all of these wonderful experiences. And I remember playing in the streets as a child, and the dinner bell would ring, and I'd come running home, and I'd find my father back from work, his tie off, apron donned, and he'd be stewing up some East Indian curry, or he'd be pressing out moistened masa harina dough for a tortilla night, for tacos, whatever it was. And each of these things represented such a physical exploration for my brother and I. Just such an experience to try, to taste, to smell, to touch, to feel, all of these new experiences. But what I also began to realize was, just as this was a physical exploration for me, it was also a way for me to begin to better know the people that already populated my life. I mean, for every dish that I encountered, it actually represented eons of culture for the boys and girls that I spent my afternoons playing with. And so just as David, uses his expert eye and witness to our world to show us a visual understanding, a visual lexicon of our world. Just as James, your beautiful and brilliant work is an amazing way to use drawing to help us further recognize and understand the world around us. So too is food. Food is a very important way through which we explore our world. And one of my great friends and colleagues at National Geographic, Sylvia Earle, there's multiple different ways in which we explore. She has always explored with wonder and awe, and I have always explored with a fork. This has led to a fair bit of argumentation between the two of us, but no love lost. The other thing that I said my parents took very seriously was reading. And one of the books I read very early on was a book called Blues by a former Yale professor, John Hersey. A brilliant, brilliant writer and a wonderful book. A conversation, a dialogue between a stranger and a fisherman about the nature of fishing and of our quest for food. And in that book, he's quoted as saying, in our quest for food, we begin to find our place in the systems of this world. And it's something that's always stuck with me very, very holistically, in that I think it quite accurately describes that we are not sovereign over our resources, but simply that we are because of them. And it's that sense of humility, which I've always taken with food, that has always allowed me to use it as a window to continue to explore our world. I was also very lucky in that I spent some of my time as a child down on the Patuxent River, one of the tributaries of the Chesapeake Bay. And there I would spend my days running up and down the dock, pulling giant male blue jimmy crabs off the pilings. With every third cast of my line would come back with it a striped bass, a perch, a porgy, a croaker, a skate, a ray, a shark, whatever it was. I mean, these things, there was bounty in these waters, which I was so familiar with. And when I was a young chef, I was about 25 years old when I first had the opportunity to step out onto my own, to craft my own menu, my own narrative about what of my experiences did I want to share with people, with my guests. And so I looked back into my history. I looked back to my experiences in the Patuxent River. I looked back to my experiences exploring my neighborhood and exploring the relationships of my life. And I said, okay, well, hey, I want bluefish, I want crab, I want oysters, I want striped bass. And I was on the phone, and I was talking to the fish guy, and I was all excited. I mean, God, this was going to be amazing. And the guy was like, kid, what are you talking about? Those are gone. What else do you want? I was like, what do you mean they're gone? He's like, oh, we ate all those. What else do you want? Come on, I'm running out of time. And it was kind of a shocking wake-up call to me. I was like, how could we be so idiotic to let something so delicious go? And yes, this is a purely selfish viewpoint I'm taking on this, but how could we let that happen? And I realized at that moment that really the guiding hand of natural selection is quite firmly holding a fork. The choices that we make for dinner, by and large, are one of the major driving factors of how this world and its systems work in this humanized world. Well, I began, as I was in D.C., to seek answers as to how this happened. Why did we let this happen? And how come we didn't do anything about it? And there are all these wonderful NGOs around me. And I was very blessed in the support that I received, the opportunities I had to learn from really, really visionary thinkers. But the answers that I got to my questions didn't really satisfy me. The answer that I got, more often than not, was an idea that has really come to represent how modern environmentalism is oftentimes sold. And that idea is based on the idea, the tragedy of the commons. Garrett Hardin's seminal paper in 1968, in which he said, man acting in his own self-interest will ultimately lead to the destruction of the commons. And that's a very short summary of a brilliant paper. Excuse me for that. But basically, the story of environmentalism is bad human bad. It's an empirical measure of how we have impacted ecosystems very much to their detriment. It is a story about how we have impacted the ecosystems. But that is not what I sold in my restaurants. I mean, think about this. What if you sat down in my restaurant and I was like, hi, welcome to Cafe St. X. Today we have a drink special called Miasma. It's actually a Manhattan without the booze, and I have two entree specials for you. One is called Shame on You, and the other is, well, woe is me. I'll be back to take your order. That doesn't work. But as I was trying to integrate some of these ideas into my menu, I found that that was the only way that I was being taught how to communicate the impact that we had on our ecosystems. That didn't work in my lexicon. It didn't work in my profession. I couldn't use that. So I began to craft a new narrative that I began to call the communion of the commons. It was a more hopeful, a more human way to discover how we are impacted by ecosystems. It is a conversation about the human role in our quest for food. Now, as I began to talk about this, I began to realize that we are the problem. And that was pretty obvious. But if we are the problem, fabulous. Fabulous. That's the best news I've heard all day. If I'm the problem, that means I'm the solution. If the choices that I make for dinner can purposefully extirpate bluefin tuna, can decimate sharks, can eradicate cod, it can lead to exponential increases in the incidences of diabetes and heart disease and obesity. If the choices that we make for dinner can do all of that, fabulous. Then the choices that we make for dinner can thus heal both our corporal bodies and our planet. And so I began to look at dinner really as an opportunity to use the choices that we make to talk about our place in the systems of this world. And that is ultimately, I think, what a conversation specifically about sustainability asks us to consider. And that's what I really want to talk about today, is the context of sustainability. And this is not about the science, the brilliant and brave visionary science that we've learned about today. This is about human use. And I want to make sure that what I'm talking about is a corresponding behavioral component of what we've heard about earlier today. One does not stand alone. The term sustainable necessitates, by virtue of its existence, that a human actor is involved. I mean, there is nothing to save by our influence or by our actions if a human is not involved. A sustainable purpose must include people. And it is this context by which we must measure our efforts and really address what our society suffers from, this great cultural anxiety of what it's going to take to actually thrive in our contemporary world, in our contemporary humanized world. And we're ultimately really trying to sustain ourselves, aren't we? I mean, we're trying to thrive. We're trying to save the way that we eat. We're trying to save where we live, how we travel, how we procreate. We are trying to save our reality. Now, in order to do that, though, we have to save the nature that allows us to lead such healthy and productive lives. Now, in Garrett Hardin's book, he quotes Alfred North Whitehead, a brilliant philosopher and historian, about the word tragedy. And I think it's important to understand this. He said, "The essence of dramatic tragedy is not unhappiness. It resides in the solemnity of the remorseless working of things. This inevitableness of destiny can only be illustrated in terms of human life by incidences which in fact involve unhappiness. For it is only by them that the futility of escape can be made evident in the drama." I think this is important to understand because tragedy of the commons is not the destruction of nature, but rather it is in us, forfeiting our access to that which we need from nature. It is our knowing forfeit of a healthy and a productive life that comes only by nature's good grace. Now, environmental campaigns, under which sustainability is often practiced and sold, have often been tools created in response to rather acute and isolated issues. Now, specifically around food, these actionable ideas have really engaged people to participate in a solution. However, there's been a notable failure on the part of some of these to really address what is the larger context of the action, to really measure the initiative against this larger framework of what those actions are hoping to accomplish. And think about this in food. We have carbon footprint, we have local, fair trade, organic, sustainable, etc. I mean, these just go on and on. We have so many of them, and many of them are very well intentioned and well purposed. However, just taking a couple of examples, organic. Do you think that Rodale, when he was in that family, was really, putting these ideas forth? It was an idea about a lifestyle, working in concert and harmony with nature to extend and ensure healthy bodies and healthy planet and healthy communities. Well, but now we have organic cigarettes. How does that play into that original intent? Fair trade, not necessarily an environmental campaign, but it's supposed to heal the wounds of globalization in our economies. It's supposed to add an ability for us to really become stewards of those who provide for us. But there's recent stories in Bolivia where a quinoa producers co-op has agreed to sell 100% of their crop to the rich into America, thus sparking fears of hunger and a dissolution of cultural heritage. That's not really what we were after with fair trade. Recycling, the most successful environmental campaign of all time. Everybody knows the mantra, reduce, reuse, recycle. Everybody. I mean, it's written into municipal law in many places. However, recycling has completely failed to address or acknowledge the fact that it's done nothing to dispel our preference for disposable goods economy. In fact, our preference for disposable goods has increased as recycling has as well. Now, yes, we should still recycle, and I don't blame recycling. I only point that out to say oftentimes we forget to continuously ask, what are we actually trying to accomplish here? And then to base our actions continuously on the goal, but not to make the action itself the purpose. Recycling is not our goal. Creating a permanent goods economy, that's where we should be focusing our efforts. The first thing about reduce, reuse, recycle, we forgot the first R, which is refuse. Just don't buy it. And then if you have to, reduce, reuse, recycle. That is the larger framework. And that is oftentimes what's missing in these environmental campaigns. In this way, environmental campaigns can actually act to strengthen a confirmation bias, allowing us to really continue on in our behaviors, and allows us to justify our behaviors. But what we really need to do is ask what we want to accomplish, and then use the action as the means, not the goal. Wendell Berry said that the way that we eat largely describes how this world is used. So how do we use this world better? Well, first off, we eat better. And then second of all, we acknowledge that food production systems are really our point of primary access to the commons that we so desperately need. And then we provide economic engagement and support for those access points. In doing so, we create a context for our actions, that we sustain access to that which we so desperately need to sustain ourselves. Put it this way, if there are no farmers, there's no farms. If there's no farms, there's no food. No fishermen, no fishery, no seafood. And yeah, you're probably saying, dummy, well, there's no seafood if there's no fish. But yes, but please remember that we're talking about sustainability here. Inherent in that is the human hand. It's not enough to have healthy fish populations. We must also be able to use them, to access them. It's not enough to have arable land if we don't know how to farm it. We have to sustain ourselves. In our sustainability campaigns, we tend to talk about food production systems as ecological models, whereas for the purpose of actually creating change, I think it's important to acknowledge that food comes to us by economic systems. Pilgrims did not set forth from Plymouth Rock to cross the Missouri to find perfectly manicured landscapes. We do not walk into the woods to find a hunt, nor do we nobly pull away from safe harbor in order to go find a fishery. These are measures of human effort put forth so nobly in order to feed other people. And I think it's very important that we address that when we talk about food production. As when we address food production solely through environmental sciences, we are simply using the wrong vernacular in order to communicate with the mechanisms of change. One must be considered with the other, though. But all too often, we're content with our efforts to seek out sustainably produced foods. And this leads to a dangerously myopic viewpoint, and it really leads to an abdication of our role as consumers. There simply is no technical solution to the problems that we face, to the environmental crises that are in front of us, that will be solved by technical solutions alone. There must also be a collaborative behavioral shift that is in how we use the product. I mean, let me put it this way. We know how to sustainably farm shrimp. Check, done, science, advanced, we got there. But then we take those sustainable shrimp and we put them on an all-you-can-eat shrimp buffet. Fail. We fail in the purpose of both using wisely the environment, but we also fail to recognize the purpose of what we sought to create through nature and our intellect. We fail to acknowledge the very purpose of food. We eat to sustain ourselves. That's why we eat. We eat to give ourselves life. And when we do not use food sustainably, we fail in that purpose. In the U.S., the USDA, 1 in 3 Americans live in insecure food households, food insecure households. That means 50 million Americans go to bed hungry twice a week. In the United States, 100 million Americans, 1 in 3, are obese. Now, those two figures are not directly corresponding to each other because the causation of hunger and of illness are far more complicated than that. However, both of those figures does provide proof that we in this country do not know very well how to use the food we are so lucky to have. Sustainable food conversations are often challenged to answer how we can expect to feed 7 billion to 9 billion people. And lots of numbers are thrown out, reports are bandied about, in order to support some new scheme to reinvent the human diet and to save the innocent victims of hunger, all noble pursuits. But what is often not talked about is that how we use our food desperately matters. And what we expect to gain from our food matters even more. Take, for example, the Peruvian anchoveta fishery. It's the world's largest single-species fishery, representing 10 to 15% of the entire global catch per annum. And yet 98% of that fish never feeds a human being. And that story is replicated multiple times across the planet. 98% of the world's largest fishery goes to feed minks and chickens and pigs, things that, yes, may end up in our diet, but guess what? I've never seen a pig go fishing. James, maybe you could help me with that with a painting. But if we're talking about hunger, why are we trying to reinvent nature? Why are we trying to alter the course of nature through genetically modified crops and commoditization of global crops? Why are we still blaming corn for not being able to feed the world when we're not actually looking at how we use the products that we have? A new report just came out from the UN and a university in UK. Said 1/3 to 50% of all the food that's created on this planet never feeds a human being. Because of rot, because of spoilage, because of politics. 1/3 of all the food created doesn't end up nourishing a person. So when we make a product the mechanism of change, we allow ourselves to really confirm our bias towards continuing in the same behaviors. We live in a humanized world, and our challenge now is really to get good at it. Our challenge is to restore the balance of our expectations of what we think this planet should provide for us, to restore pride, prudence, and profitability of those economic systems that provide for our tables. Environmentalism really is no more than the sum of our individual will to recognize that we are interrelated and dependent upon nature. So let's use dinner as a means to communicate what we think about nature and about our place in its systems. Dinner is a full-contact, intimate, and celebratory relationship through which we literally take the world into our bodies. Its life becomes a transcommunication, thus supporting our own. So as you sit down to dinner tonight, I just ask that you acknowledge what you expect the food you're about to eat to give you. Consider how the choices you make for dinner might bring prosperity to your community. And ultimately, I ask you to eat with joy and be thankful that we may continue to participate in the bounty of this big, beautiful, and frankly, mostly blue planet. So thank you.